Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a great week. This is week, what week are we in? Week 4. We are moving into sociology of deviance this week. So my goal here is provide some background information, context, give you some things to think about, and then kind of pose a few questions for you to address in your review and exploration assignment. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating area getting into looking at deviance from a sociological perspective. It forces us to look at both the macro level, institutions, culture, kind of process kind of things, big impacts like what we're calling back to week 1, Durkheim and social facts, things external to the self that shape the individual. So we're going to kind of get into a lot of different things that bring into question that something is deviant just because it's bad. I think that's kind of a real limited perspective, and it removes from kind of an examination of all the different kind of influences that go on into what becomes defined as being deviant, why it has become defined as being deviant, and sometimes it may be due to the objective conditions because something is bad or detrimental to society, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes something that can be very harmful to society or to people within society, but it's not defined as deviant. Or vice versa. So we're going to try to, through this content, really just trying to examine deviance, take that sociological perspective, the macro level, institutions, culture, society, and then all the way down to the individual, looking at individual identities, individual perceptions, and these kind of things. So I think one thing to keep in mind in this content, as well as moving forward, is we're really talking about general patterns of behavior. So the general and the particular. A concept from earlier in the term. And the idea is that, in social sciences and a lot of areas of examination of something, you're looking for patterns of behavior. Not everyone fits that particular pattern. So we have to be comfortable dealing with patterns. We're looking at things like drug use rate, homelessness, child abuse rate, what are the demographics, whatever it might be, we have to be talking in generalities, looking for patterns of behavior. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing to looking at deviance, I think, a model to use and thinking about deviance is when we think about deviance from a sociological perspective, we're going to move away from psychological or from individual related lens or sort of looking at individual neurological kind of preconditions or factors or individual personality. We're going to move away from these kind of things and move into the social, cultural. So one framework of doing that is to think about, when we're looking at deviance, we're looking at the actor, or let's start with the act. So we got to examine the act. I'll give you an example. Let's say domestic violence. Spouse abuse, domestic violence wasn't always defined as being deviant or criminal. It really wasn't, until, let's say, industrialization moving forward, where domestic violence became identified as a social issue, social problem. And really it wasn't until the 1970s really started to develop laws and measures that address more intentionally, more forcefully, and issues of domestic violence and spousal abuse. And we still have challenges in that area, making sure that individuals who are physically, sexually abused within a context of relationship, that they are being protected and they have rights that are being protected as well. So when we look at the act, we are starting to raise questions about the act. Well, when does it become defined as being deviant? How does it become defined as being deviant? What's the difference between the objective conditions, the level of harm, and whether or not something is deviant itself? So we're kind of asking questions about that kind of thing. And the reason to do that is so we can better understand how something becomes defined as being deviant. And then we can be more reflexive and more reflective on our current kind of world and situation, and look for areas in which things maybe they should be defined as deviant or maybe not, right? So that things become more open to evaluation and to analysis, and that's, I think, always a good thing. Just a real quick side note, child abuse is sort of another factor. The Society for Prevention for Cruelty to Animals, SPCA, existed before there was a Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Both these organizations came about in the 1800s during a time period of mass urbanization and industrialization. In a rural context, if you were a farmer, you're working in land, you protected your animals and your livestock. They helped feed the family. Kids were probably well protected in those environments as well. And then you move to this sort of more anonymous, industrial, urban sort of culture environment. These social problems and issues start to come up in Society for Prevention for Cruelty to Animals, where actually animals were protected before children. So that kind of gives you sort of another example about what we do when we examine the act. The other thing is to examine the actor becomes really important. So we look at the status of the individual who committed a particular act or is thinking in a particular way or has a particular condition. So the status of the individual makes a difference. In my face-to-face classes, I give the example of binge drinking, of beer bonging. Does the status of the individual make a difference? Does it matter if the person is male or female? Does the age of the participant make a difference? If there's a group of 75-year-old individuals who are beer bonging, does that make a difference in terms of our interpretation, evaluation, judgment of that versus if it's a group of 22-year-olds? And in a particular setting, right? The setting makes a difference. So before I go there, I guess finish up with the actor. Thinking about the status position of the actor may make a difference. Social class may make a difference. The social class position of the individual who's committing an act of deviance. Whether it's a middle-class person, upper middle-class person, kind of occupation the person may occupy. I mean, all these factors, it's more complicated than it's like, something is deviant because it's deviant, right? It's a lot driven by how we're defining something. So the act, and then we're looking at the actor, the status position of the actor themselves, and then finally the setting, the context makes the difference. We interpret things through the context. So something may be very inappropriate in one context, move to a different context, it could be totally appropriate. And that context could be physical context, right? So the physical setting. It could be also historical and cultural. So we shift time period, we shift place, we change meaning. So those are some things to consider and look at when we're looking at the area of deviance. Another thing to consider or look at is not all deviance is or to be identified as being deviant doesn't mean somebody did something voluntarily. Deviance could be something that's involuntary. So if I had a physical blemish, a major physical blemish or physical deformation, I was born with that deformation. I may be identified as being deviant from others, but it was something that I had no control over. It was involuntary in terms of anything that I did. Physical disabilities for a long period of time, are heavily stigmatized, much less so today, for sure. But not everything that's deviant is necessarily voluntary. And then deviance is sometimes it's the behavior. I said the act. So it's the act. Could also be ways of thinking. Sometimes people who hold on to ideas that are counter to the dominant view in a culture may be identified as being deviant. I mean, go back in history like Galileo. Galileo and his views of using science and development, his looking out into the stars and looking out into the world outside of the earth. Right, he challenged the church and the church's sort of views, and so he was condemned for that. So sometimes it's the beliefs that individuals have, not only the act, but beliefs. And then sometimes it's conditions, like I mentioned, physical deformations and things like that. Okay, so now let me give you a little bit of background or a little bit of application of the three different theories and why they're important. So the functionalist perspective has the idea, if we look at functionalism, right, that society is built on this sort of value consensus working to establish order within society itself. And so society is a problem-solving entity. So if we have a social issue develops, we form an organization to respond to it to help maintain balance and order. So, the first law enforcement department is in the city of Boston in the United States, I can't remember the year, in the 1800s. So this institution arose in response to a need within communities, a need for safety and security as we became more urban and more industrial environment. So functionalism looks at that component. Functionalism also has a sort of viewpoint that if something is universal, which deviance is, all societies across all time have deviance within them. They may define different things as being deviant, and what those things may change across time. But all societies have individuals mark boundaries. They have boundaries between what is right and what's wrong, and that's what helps define the group. So functionalism would say deviance is universal. It fulfills a need. And I think the textbook does a good job walking through some of the functions of deviance. It's through deviance that we can define what is right and what is wrong. Deviance is sometimes it sort of brings group energy and it helps define that them versus us versus them sort of mentality kind of things that are going on. And it's fascinating to think about through that kind of lens. I mean, one example I used to think about or use is looking at historical perspectives on Americans' response to immigration. And this would be true in other countries as well. During times when people feel threatened economically, socially, politically, when there's division, oftentimes illegal immigrants or immigrants in general get identified as being the other, as being deviant, as being an outsider, as being someone to be feared. And this goes back a long way in history. I mean, the first group who was identified as being a problem for American society was the Chinese, and this was after the development of the railroad, where Chinese were working on the railroad. And once the railroad was completed, Chinese laborers migrated to urban settings in the West Coast primarily, created a lot of concerns from those in the dominant culture, and the response was this demonization of Chinese. And we can fast forward and look at that contemporary environment, sort of like where we're at today, is we need to have a good discussion about what is the best policy regarding immigration. But some of the emotion that comes out in response to immigration today has a lot to do with this sort of functionalist analysis, is that when people and groups feel threatened, where maybe they're falling behind economically, the working class, and so they scapegoat their problems onto this other group, and it's about social solidarity in some sort of way. So that's kind of the functionalist viewpoint, is what we define as deviant is a reflection of our consensus of values, the shared values we have within a culture. So if we see that, that abusing dogs is a problem, we don't like that, we establish laws to help address that particular thing. And then we have these functions of deviance kind of thing. The interactionist perspective gets us into labeling, sort of perspectives and thinking about how we define deviance. So this becomes a kind of a powerful thing, that nothing is inherently deviant. We make it deviant. So it's how we define certain things. Marijuana has a fascinating long history in terms of definition. It wasn't until the 1920s and 1930s in the United States where we defined it as sort of the devil weed, sort of demonization of marijuana. And of course, look where we're at today, here in the state of Oregon. I mean, quite a major transformation. Well, in some ways, the THC levels, the pharmacological properties of substance are actually probably more of a concern today than back in the 1920s, 30s, and 1960s. But yet, it's changing meaning, right? The substance may not change, or the object may not change, but its people's meanings may change. And the other thing to think about is the impact of stigma on individuals who get defined as being deviant. So, an individual gets labeled as being deviant. What's the impact on that person's identity and how other people interact with that individual? And that's something powerful to think about when we look at this interactionist perspective. And then finally, conflict theory, looking at the area of inequalities, right? Looking at race, class, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, other areas of difference, and how inequalities can influence behavior. Inequalities, get expressed in different ways. So if we have significant inequalities in society, that may get expressed in particular behaviors that the dominant group or that society sees as a problem. And rather than dealing with the underlying factors that's causing that behavior, as we focus on the individual, demonize the individual versus trying to address the circumstance or address the inequalities that exist within the environment. And the other thing about conflict theory too is to look at the law is not applied equally to everyone. I mean, there's class biases, there's race biases that are built within the system. Just an examination of people on death row, and you can look at the race class factors in that. And you just sort of go down the list, is that, there's that system, the criminal justice system, is a system that, as with any system in the United States, there's a lot of inequalities that are expressed through that. So the question I want you to sort of address for your review and an exploration assignment for this week is I want you to take, 200 words, 200, 300 words, is to identify an area of deviance. So it could be, I'll give you a few examples. The opioid, people with an opioid addiction. Look at homelessness. That'd be just two different examples. And to identify how does one of the theories apply to that. So just take one of the theories. If you want to take more than one, that's fine too, but make them a little bit shorter. But how can you use that theory to guide you in your examination of that particular area of deviance? You don't necessarily have to have the answers of what that application, what the research says, but more how do you think through looking at a particular area of deviance through that particular lens. All right, so thanks for all you do. Thanks for all the great contributions in the class. Look forward to your review of this assignment for this week. Hope you're having a great day, and stay tuned.